Luther, open the gate. My guests arrive in 10 minutes.
Mr. Hale's instructions are that no one enters without his authorization, ma'am.
He's been doing whatever I say for 18 years. He'll move.
Marissa, they're looking.
I ended the marriage. That doesn't mean I left my house.
Is that still how you see it?
Everything here belongs to me.
She had walked out of that gate 3 days earlier with the marriage declared over her words, not mine. But standing at that same locked entrance now, she spoke about the property, the way someone speaks about something they have never once had to question. The investors were watching. Grant was watching. And from somewhere above them, so was I. The claim she made in front of all those people that everything behind that gate was hers was loud, precise, and witnessed. She delivered it like a closing argument. How long before she realized it was also a confession? If you've ever stayed quiet while someone else rewrote the story, this one's for you. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what happens next. 3 days before she stood at that gate and made her declaration in front of an audience, I was the kind of man most people in her world couldn't quite categorize. I didn't attend the charity galas she organized. I didn't show up in the background of her press photos. When her colleagues asked what her husband did for a living, I heard later that she would say something like, "He works in development," in a tone that suggested the conversation didn't need to go further. For a long time, I told myself that was fine. I had spent enough years learning that the moment people know the real shape of what you own, they stop seeing you and start seeing the number. My name is Donovan Hale. I'm 45 years old, and I've been designing and investing in commercial real estate since my late 20s, quietly, methodically, without much interest in being known for it. The estate my father left me when I was 26 gave me the foundation, and I built everything else from there. A mid-sized development firm, several commercial properties across 3 states, and a portfolio that would have surprised anyone who had ever watched Marissa introduce me as her low-key husband at a dinner party. I never corrected the impression. I never saw the point. The house was the first major thing I built entirely on my own. I bought the land with inheritance money 2 years before I met Marissa, designed the structure myself, and oversaw every phase of construction. By the time she moved in after our wedding, it had been mine for 3 years. I didn't sit her down to explain that. It simply never came up the way it might have if she had ever asked. Marcus Webb asked me once, about 7 years into my marriage, why I had never shown Marissa the full picture of what I had. We were sitting in the office we shared on the 4th floor of the Hale Group building, a detail Marissa thought was a small co-working arrangement between 2 friends, and he was looking at me with the kind of patience that meant he already knew the answer and was waiting to see if I did too. I told him I didn't need her to know. He didn't push back right away. He just nodded slowly and said, "As long as you're sure that's the only reason." I didn't think much about that conversation for years. I think about it now. Marcus has been my closest friend since we were both broke and overconfident in our early 30s, and he has been my business partner for nearly as long. He is direct in the way that people who genuinely care about you are direct, not to be cruel, but because he has decided that honesty is the only useful thing he can offer. He knew everything about my finances, my properties, my actual position in the world, and he watched over the course of years as I chose to keep all of that invisible inside my own marriage. I met Marissa Sutton when she was 29 and working as a junior communications consultant for a firm that was at the time struggling. She was sharp and restless and had opinions about everything, and she delivered those opinions with a kind of concentrated energy that I found genuinely compelling. But what made me stay, what made me think this was something real, was that in those early months, she looked at me without calculating anything. She didn't know what I owned. She didn't ask. She was interested in the conversation, in the work I described, in the way I thought about spaces and structure and what buildings could mean to the people inside them. That felt rare. I had learned by then to be careful around people who looked at me differently once certain information changed hands. So I fell in love with a woman who I believed loved me before she had any reason to want something from me. And for a while, I think that was true. The early years of our marriage were genuinely good. When Marissa decided she wanted to start her own firm, I helped her not by stepping in front of her, but by opening the right doors at the right moments, making introductions she didn't know she needed, letting her believe she had found her way to those rooms on her own. Sutton Strategies grew from a two-person operation in a rented office into something real, something with reputation and revenue and a client list that Marissa had worked hard to build. I was proud of her. I want to be honest about that. Whatever happened later, there was a period when watching her succeed felt like something I had contributed to, and I was glad. But at some point, I couldn't name the exact year if I tried something shifted in the way she spoke about her work when I was in the room. The story she told started to leave me out of it entirely, and then it started to frame me as a footnote, and then eventually it started to treat my presence in her life as something slightly embarrassing. Not loudly, not in a way that made scenes. It was the kind of diminishment that happens in adjustments so small you almost don't notice until you look back and realize the picture has changed completely. In social settings with her clients and investors, she introduced me with a particular smile warm enough on the surface but calibrated to communicate that I was background. She would mention that I did some work in real estate and then redirect the conversation before anyone could follow up. I watched this happen at dinner parties at her firm's anniversary events, at the kinds of gatherings she held at the house with people who were important to her ambitions. The house she called her greatest achievement. The house she had photographs of on her firm's website. The house whose address appeared in at least 2 of her investor presentations as evidence of her financial standing. Marcus brought that last detail to my attention about 3 years ago. He had seen one of the decks during a meeting where their paths had briefly crossed professionally, and he called me that evening and said, calm and careful, "Your address is in her pitch materials, Donovan, not as your shared home, as her primary asset." I told him I would talk to her about it. I didn't. I kept thinking I would find the right moment, and the right moment kept not arriving, and eventually I accepted without quite admitting it to myself that I was avoiding something I didn't want to have to name. The cracks I had been stepping around for years became impossible to ignore about 4 months before everything broke open. Marissa started coming home later, and her phone became something she held differently, angled away, set face down, taken with her when she left the room. I noticed but said nothing at first. Then I noticed more. A name that appeared repeatedly in her messages the one time she left her phone on the counter and walked away. Grant Ellison, the director of strategy she had hired 18 months earlier and praised constantly in the way people sometimes praise the people they are comparing you to. When I finally said his name to her directly, she didn't deny anything. That surprised me. I had half-expected excuses, some version of a story I might have chosen to believe. Instead, she went very still for a moment and then said I had no right to go through her things. I told her I hadn't gone through anything. I had seen what she left in the open. She said I had always been paranoid, that I had always needed to feel like I was the most important person in the room, even though I was never actually in any room that mattered. Every sentence was designed to redirect, to make the subject my failures instead of her choices. I had been in enough negotiations over the years to recognize when someone was trying to change the terms of a conversation rather than answer the question on the table. I didn't raise my voice. I sat across from her in the kitchen of the house I had built before she ever walked through its front door, and I waited to see what she would do when I didn't take the bait. What she did was look at me with something I can only describe as settled contempt, not fury, not guilt, but the expression of someone who has made a decision and is finished pretending otherwise. She said, "You're not my husband anymore." Then she walked upstairs and I heard the sound of a suitcase being pulled from the closet. By the time she came back downstairs with 2 bags, I was still in the kitchen. She didn't look at me on her way out. At the front door, without turning around, she said she would be back at the end of the week with guests, and I should make sure the caterers had access. She said it the way you speak to a building manager. Then the door closed, and through the window I watched a car I didn't recognize, Grant Ellison's, I would later confirm, pull away from the curb. I sat there for a long time in a house that had been mine for over 20 years, and felt for reasons I still can't fully articulate like a stranger in it. Marcus arrived within an hour of me calling him. I hadn't told him what happened on the phone, I just said, "Come over." But when he walked in and saw my expression, he didn't ask what was wrong. He sat down across from me at the same kitchen table and said, "Tell me what you want to do." Not what I was going to do about Marissa. Not how I was going to handle this. He asked what I wanted, and it was such a simple question that it took me almost a full minute to realize I didn't have an immediate answer. What I knew was this: for 18 years, I had quietly repaired every consequence Marissa created. I had smoothed over the professional mistakes she made early on. I had absorbed the social cost of her choices. I had let her build an image partly constructed on a foundation I had provided and never once asked her to acknowledge. And the night she walked out and told me I was no longer her husband, her only thought about the house I had designed and built was that she intended to use it for a party at the end of the week. I called Claudia Benton the next morning. Claudia had managed my family's legal and financial documentation for over a decade, and she knew every detail of how the estate was structured. She confirmed what I already knew: the property deed carried my name alone. The land had been purchased from a personal inheritance account before my marriage. There was no joint financial contribution to the original construction. Whatever Marissa had spent on decor and minor renovations over the years had come from household accounts I funded. I had every record. That afternoon, I called Luther Pike, the property manager who had worked the estate for 11 years. I told him that access protocols were changing immediately. New codes, new keys, new standing instructions, no entry without my direct authorization. Luther asked no questions. He said he understood, and that was the end of it. I changed every lock and every code that evening. The gate system, the side entrance, the garage, all of it. I had spent nearly 2 decades making myself smaller inside my own life, fitting into the version of our marriage that was convenient for Marissa's story. Stepping back so she could step forward, keeping quiet about what I actually owned because I didn't want wealth to complicate the one thing I thought was genuine between us. And for 18 years I had operated on the belief that the woman who once looked at me without calculating anything still existed somewhere underneath the person she had become. The night I changed those codes, I stopped operating on that belief. What came next was not something I planned as revenge. I want to be clear about that. I simply decided for the first time in a very long time to stop protecting Marissa Sutton from the consequences of her own decisions. 3 days later, she came back to the gate with Grant Ellison, a group of investors, and absolute certainty that I would move out of her way. She had been wrong about a great many things over the years. That one would cost her the most. She arrived on a Saturday afternoon, which I knew she would. Marissa had always understood the value of an audience, and a Saturday gave her the maximum number of people to impress. I watched from the upper floor as 3 cars pulled up to the gate. Her white SUV first, then Grant Ellison's silver sedan, then a black car carrying 4 people I recognized from the financial press as mid-level investors in the commercial development space. She had chosen her audience carefully. These were people whose opinion of her mattered, people whose money she wanted, people she needed to believe that the woman stepping out of that white SUV was exactly who she had always presented herself to be. What she hadn't accounted for was that none of those people would be stepping through my gate. Luther had positioned himself near the intercom panel as I had asked. When Marissa entered the old code, the one she had used for years, nothing happened. She tried it again, then a third time with the particular deliberateness of someone who believes that repetition will eventually correct a mechanical error. When it didn't, she pressed the intercom button, and I heard her voice through the feed I had running in the study. She spoke to Luther in the same tone she used with catering staff, clipped, expectant, already mildly disappointed. Luther's response was the same one he would give every time she asked for the next 30 minutes that he worked for the sole owner of the property, and the sole owner had not authorized entry for today's visit. I came out to the balcony after she had been at the gate for about 10 minutes. I didn't call down to her. I just stood there, and eventually she looked up and saw me, and something in her expression shifted not into guilt, but into the particular kind of fury that comes from being publicly contradicted by someone you have decided doesn't have that right. She called my name in a way that was meant to sound commanding, and came out sounding desperate. Then she said loudly enough for everyone behind her to hear that I was being childish, that I was embarrassing myself, that she had guests who had driven a long way, and I needed to open the gate immediately. I didn't respond. I stood on the balcony and waited, and the silence I held was more effective than anything I could have said. Grant Ellison came to stand beside Marissa and said something to her quietly. I couldn't hear, but I could read his posture, which was the posture of a man who is starting to calculate risk. The investors had stepped out of their car and were watching. One of them had his hands in his pockets and was looking at the house with an expression I recognized from years of reading rooms during negotiations. He was reassessing. He had come here believing certain things about the woman who had invited him, and the scene at the gate was introducing a variable he hadn't planned for. Marissa turned back to the intercom and said, her voice now raised past the point of pretending this was a minor inconvenience, that this was her house, that I had no right to lock her out of her own property, and that if I didn't open the gate in the next 60 seconds, she would call her attorney. I had been expecting that line. What followed was something I had prepared for. The estate had a display screen mounted beside the gate part of the property management system. I had updated 2 years earlier when Claudia recommended we digitize the full documentation archive for the estate's insurance and title review. I activated it remotely from the balcony. The screen was large enough to be read clearly from the driveway, and what it displayed now was the original deed of purchase for the land dated more than 20 years ago. Below it, the construction permits all carrying my name. Below that, the title documentation showing sole ownership unmodified at any point during the marriage. I pressed the intercom on my end and said only this: "You declared the marriage over and walked out of this house 3 days ago. I changed the codes after you left. That's the full story." The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest thing I had heard in weeks. One of the investors walked toward the screen and spent a long moment reading it. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Grant Ellison was watching him do it, and I could see even from the balcony the moment Grant understood what this meant, not just for today, but for every presentation Marissa had given where the address of this property had appeared in her materials. Every meeting where the photographs of this house had served as evidence of her financial credibility, every time she had spoken about her assets to people whose money she was trying to attract. The foundation of that image had just been documented in public on a screen she could not turn off in front of the exact people it mattered most to deceive. Grant took a step back from Marissa. It was a small movement, the kind of thing you might not notice if you weren't watching for it. I noticed. Marissa turned and looked at him, and whatever passed between them in that moment was private enough that I couldn't read it from where I stood. But she turned back to the gate alone, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed in a way that told me the performance was over, and what was left was something rawer and more dangerous. She said she would fight this. She said I hadn't heard the last of anything. Then she got back in her car and the other vehicles followed, and the driveway was empty in under 3 minutes. I stood on the balcony for a while after they left. Not in triumph, I want to be precise about this, but in something closer to exhaustion. 18 years is a long time to carry something, and the act of finally setting it down doesn't feel the way you imagine it will. It just feels like weight leaving your hands and then a kind of unfamiliar quiet where the weight used to be. Claudia called me that evening to tell me what she had anticipated. Marissa had already contacted an attorney. By the following Monday, the divorce filing was in motion, and attached to it was a claim against the property on the grounds that it had served as the marital home for the duration of the marriage, that Marissa had contributed financially to renovations, and that the increased value of the estate during the marriage constituted a shared asset. None of it was legally sound, given the documentation I had provided to Claudia before any of this started. But a weak legal argument can still do damage when it's paired with the right story in the right places, and Marissa was better than almost anyone I had ever met at constructing stories for the right places. Within a week, there were articles. Not major coverage. She was careful about that. Careful not to expose herself to scrutiny. She couldn't control but targeted mentions in the kinds of publications her professional community read. The narrative she planted was specific and sympathetic. A self-made businesswoman. A troubled marriage to a man who had always resented her success. A husband who had seized the opportunity of her absence to lock her out of the home she had built her life around. She didn't name me directly in most of it. She didn't need to. The people who mattered to her business knew who she was talking about, and they began to ask questions about my conduct in ways that started to create friction with 2 of my own commercial partners. Marcus called me on a Wednesday evening, and his voice carried the specific quality it had when he had thought something through from multiple angles before deciding to say it. He told me that staying quiet was no longer a neutral position, that silence in this environment was being read as confirmation. He said, "The story she's telling is filling the space you're leaving empty. You need to decide if you're comfortable with that." It was the clearest thing anyone said to me during that entire period. And it was also the thing I had been avoiding thinking about directly because acting on it meant giving up the privacy I had protected for most of my adult life. I called Claudia the next morning and told her to prepare everything. Every document, every account record, the full purchase history of the property, every construction invoice, every payment I had made toward the renovations Marissa was now claiming as her own contributions. We pulled the household account records, showing that every expense she had described as her financial investment in the estate had been drawn from accounts I funded. We prepared all of it and made it available through proper legal channels, and within 10 days the picture was complete and unambiguous. What the full documentation review uncovered went further than the property dispute. Claudia's team identified a pattern in Marissa's recent investor materials, specifically in the funding documents for the commercial deal she had been preparing to announce at the house that Saturday. The property was listed not as a personal residence, but as a primary asset used to establish her financial standing as a lead investor in a multi-million-dollar venture. People had committed capital to this deal in part because of what her asset profile suggested about her stability and resources. And the asset at the center of that profile didn't belong to her. There was something else. The more Claudia's team examined the structure of the deal, the clearer it became that Marissa had not designed this strategy on her own. The specific way the property had been incorporated into the materials, the language, the placement, the way it implied ownership without technically stating it bore the marks of someone with deep experience in investment documentation. Someone like Grant Ellison, who had spent years before joining Sutton Strategies working in investment structuring. It appeared he had guided Marissa into a position where her name was on documents that, if the deal were ever audited, would make her the responsible party. And he had made sure his own fingerprints were light enough to lift cleanly. When this picture became clear to Marissa's own legal team, the response was swift and without sentiment. Grant stopped returning her calls. He sent a message through a mutual contact stating that he had no involvement in the documentation decisions and that any representations made in the investor materials were Marissa's sole responsibility. He resigned from Sutton Strategies within the same week, and he took with him 3 of the firm's largest long-term clients' people. He had cultivated relationships with over 18 months people who had come to see him as the operational intelligence behind the brand. I did not feel satisfaction when Marcus told me what had happened. I want to say that clearly. I had never wanted Grant Ellison to be the instrument of Marissa's consequences. I had wanted her to face them honestly, directly in proportion to what she had actually done. Instead, she was facing them through the exit of someone who had used her the way she had used other people, and there is no clean or satisfying shape to that. It's just the logic of certain choices playing out to their end. What remained was Marissa at the center of a collapsing structure. The property claim was effectively dead. Claudia had already received signals from the other side that the argument was being quietly withdrawn. The investment deal was in serious jeopardy, with 2 of the 4 investors requesting documentation reviews. Sutton Strategies was bleeding its most valuable relationships, and the man she had chosen over an 18-year marriage had handed her the consequences and walked out without looking back. She called me on a Thursday night. I saw her name on the screen and let it ring. Then she called again, and something in the repetition, the persistence of it, made me answer. Not because I thought anything good would come from the conversation, but because I had learned over many years that the things you avoid tend to find you anyway, and it's usually better to meet them on your own terms. Her voice on the phone was unlike anything I had heard from her in years. The architecture of confidence she had built and maintained so carefully was gone, and what was underneath it was something tired and undefended and difficult to listen to. Not because it moved me toward forgiveness, but because it was the first honest sound I had heard from her in longer than I could easily remember. She asked if we could meet. She said she needed to talk to me in person. She said she had made a terrible mistake and she thought I deserved to hear that directly. I told her I would meet her on Saturday morning. And then I sat in the quiet of the house I had built over 20 years ago, in the same kitchen where she had told me I was no longer her husband. And I thought about what it means to be ready for a conversation you have already decided won't change anything. She chose a cafe. I had never been to a small place on the east side of the city. the kind with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu and no history between us. I understood the choice without her having to explain it. The restaurants she usually preferred were places where she was known, where the staff recognized her, and the lighting was flattering, and the room itself was another form of presentation. This cafe was neutral ground, which meant she had thought carefully about what she was walking into and had decided she needed to arrive without props. Marcus came by the house the morning of the meeting. He didn't ask to come. I called him, which told him everything he needed to know about where my head was. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and listened while I said things out loud that I had mostly been keeping to myself. And when I was done, he was quiet for a moment before he said, "You don't owe her forgiveness, but you owe yourself honesty." I asked him what he meant by that. He said, "You've been telling yourself this is about principle. Make sure you know if it's also about something else before you walk into that room." It wasn't an accusation. It was the question of someone who knew me well enough to ask the thing I hadn't asked myself. I thought about it on the drive over, and by the time I parked, I had my answer. It wasn't about something else. The part of me that had loved Marissa Sutton had made its peace quietly and without drama, sometime between the night she walked out and the morning I changed the codes. What remained was not anger, not longing, just the steady clarity of a man who has finally decided to stop negotiating with a situation that was never going to improve. She was already there when I arrived, seated at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't been drinking. She looked different from the woman who had stood at my gate 2 weekends earlier demanding entry in front of an audience. The posture was the same. She had always carried herself well, but the particular quality of her composure had changed. It was the composure of effort, now not habit. She was holding herself together, and I could see exactly how hard she was working to make that invisible. She began with the apology she had prepared. I could tell it was prepared not because it was insincere in every detail, but because it had the structure of something that had been revised. The parts that were most likely to land came first, and the sentences that acknowledged specific failures were followed immediately by context that softened them. She said that Grant had guided her into decisions she hadn't fully understood. She said she had lost herself somewhere in the ambition of the last several years. She said I had been a better husband than she had known how to receive, and she believed she understood that now in a way she hadn't before. Every sentence was technically true, and every sentence was framed to move the conversation toward a particular destination she had decided on before she sat down. I let her finish. Then I asked her one question. "Do you miss me or do you miss the house?" She looked at me across the table and I watched something move through her expression. Not guilt exactly, but recognition. She knew what the question was really asking. She knew that I knew. And for a moment I thought she might actually answer it honestly, which would have been in its own way a kind of resolution. Instead, she reached across the table and said, "Can we just go home first? We can work through the rest of it once I'm back." Her voice was gentle when she said it. She meant it to sound like a peace offering. It was the most honest thing she said all morning and not in the way she intended. Because the question I had asked was about me, about whether I was the thing she wanted to return to, and her answer was about the gate code. She had not misunderstood the question. She had answered the one that mattered more to her, and she had answered it without realizing she was doing it. I reached into the jacket folded on the chair beside me and set the divorce papers on the table between us. I had brought them with me, signed on my end, because I had known before I walked in that this was where the morning would end. Claudia had prepared them the week prior. I slid them across without ceremony and said, "I spent 18 years making sure you didn't have to face the things you set in motion. That's done now." Marissa looked at the papers for a long time without touching them. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet in the way that was real, not the performed emotion of the prepared apology, but something that had arrived without her planning for it. I didn't look away, and I didn't try to make it easier. There are moments where the kindest thing you can do is hold still and let someone experience the full weight of what they have chosen. She didn't sign them that morning at the cafe, but Claudia received them back within the week, and by the time the legal process concluded, the property claim had already been formally withdrawn. Her own attorneys had made the case to her plainly continuing to contest the estate would require discovery proceedings that would pull the investor documentation into a formal legal context, and at that point, the misrepresentation used to attract capital for the commercial deal would become a matter of record. It was not a risk any competent counsel would recommend she take. The divorce was finalized without a hearing. Marissa retained everything she had built independently through Sutton strategies. I had no interest in her business, had never touched it, and made no claim on it. What I kept was what had always been mine: the estate, the Hale Group holdings, the portfolio that had never appeared in any conversation we had about money because I had spent 18 years making sure it didn't need to. The settlement was clean. There was nothing left to argue about. Grant Ellison's situation resolved itself through channels that had nothing to do with me directly. The investors who had committed to the commercial deal requested a full audit once the documentation questions surfaced, and what the audit revealed about how the funding materials had been structured was enough to open a formal inquiry. Grant's history in investment structuring made his role in the document design difficult to credibly deny, and the professional consequences that followed were proportionate to what he had actually done. Marissa faced her own review. She had signed the materials, and being misled by someone you trusted is not the same as being blameless for what you signed. She was not prosecuted. But the professional damage was real and lasting, and the version of Sutton strategies that existed on the other side of that process was a smaller, quieter thing than what she had been building. I released enough of the documentation publicly to correct the narrative she had planted in the industry press, not as a campaign, not as a dismantling, but as a factual correction made through appropriate channels and then left alone. I did not give interviews. I did not pursue coverage. I said what needed to be said to protect my own reputation and the reputation of the Hale Group, and then I stopped talking about it entirely. Some people in our former shared social world interpreted my restraint as indifference. Others, I think, understood it for what it was: the behavior of someone who has already moved on and doesn't need the last word. The year that followed was the quietest and most productive of my professional life. I had been carrying something for a long time, not just the marriage, but the habit of self-erasure that had grown up around it. The instinct to minimize, to step back, to make sure I occupied as little space as possible in rooms where Marissa needed to be the one who filled them. With that weight gone, I found I had considerably more energy for the work I had always cared about, and I found myself thinking about it differently. Not just as a business, but as something that could mean more than it had before. About 8 months after the divorce was finalized, I converted a section of the estate into a permanent space for a program I had been sketching out in my head for longer than I wanted to admit. It was a mentorship and funding initiative for early career architects, specifically those who had spent time working inside firms or partnerships where their contributions had been absorbed into someone else's legacy, where the person with the better title or the louder voice had walked away with the credit. I had known that experience from a distance for most of my adult life, and I had watched it happen to people I respected. The program offered direct mentorship access to my professional network and seed funding for independent projects. The first cohort was 12 people. The application list had been 4 times that. Marcus was the first person I invited to the opening event. We stood together on the balcony, the same balcony where I had looked down at Marissa's car blocking my driveway on a Saturday afternoon that felt like it belonged to a different decade, and watched that section of the house fill with people who were there because they had been invited, not because they were trying to take something. Marcus didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "This is what the house was always supposed to be." I didn't argue with that. He was probably right. The evening was still going when I noticed the car on the far side of the gate. It was parked along the curb just past the entrance, positioned in the way of someone who had slowed down and then not quite continued. I recognized the white SUV from a distance the way you recognize a thing you have looked at many times without meaning to memorize it. Marissa sat in the car for several minutes. From the balcony, I could see that the gate was fully lit. The event lighting spilled out far enough to illuminate the entrance, and through the gate, she would have been able to see the section of the house I had converted, the people moving inside it, the evidence of something happening in a space she had once treated as her personal backdrop. I don't know how long she had been parked there before I noticed. I don't know what she was thinking. I know that she never reached for the intercom, and I know she never tried the keypad because there was nothing to try. The code she had memorized over 18 years no longer existed. I watched her from the balcony, and I did nothing. Not because I wanted her to feel it, though I suspect she did, but because there was genuinely nothing left to do. I had no speech for her. I had no final accounting I needed her to receive. The version of me that would have stood there composing sentences in his head, preparing some clean articulation of everything she had cost us. Both had already finished that work and moved on. What I felt standing on that balcony was not triumph. It was something more like the absence of a familiar ache, the strange lightness of a wound that has finally, after a very long time, closed. The white SUV pulled away from the curb after a while. I watched the taillights until they disappeared around the corner, and then I turned back to the party and went downstairs to be with the people who were glad I had opened the gate for them. Behind me, the gate swung slowly shut on its automatic track the way it always did after the last guest entered, the way it had done 1,000 times before under different circumstances. It didn't close against Marissa exactly. She had already driven away. It closed the way all things close when their moment has passed, without drama, without announcement, simply because it was time. She had declared the marriage over with the certainty of someone who had never imagined the declaration might have consequences for her. What she hadn't considered, what I think she genuinely never saw, was that I had spent 18 years building something she was only ever passing through. The gate was always mine to close. I had just been waiting without quite knowing I was waiting for a good enough reason to finally do it. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever quietly held something together while someone else rewrote the story and took the credit, then you already know what it feels like to stand on that balcony. The people who build in silence rarely get the recognition, but they always keep the foundation. If that resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. There are more stories like this one waiting, and you won't want to miss what comes next.